You're listening to the Getting Smart podcast. I'm Rebecca Midles. Today, we're trying to understand what are the core competencies of a modern leader. When I think of essential competencies of a leader, I think of visionary thinking, an unwavering commitment to equity, the courage to embrace innovation, and the humility to empower others. And in my world, we spend a lot of time talking about personalized learning and student outcomes. We share ideas of graduates who will be critical thinkers, innovators, problem solvers, or I like to say solutionaries. In our educational career, we have spent countless hours in professional learning. I can think of so many Sundays, how many times I've sat there crafting new units or projects, obsessing over new student data. But what about the leaders? What do we do for the leaders of our system? Laura Hilger, who's joining us today, and I share our very first dive into site leadership, starting at the same learning system, Highland in Anchorage, Alaska. I know I was wrestling with this transition. Even though I was more than grounded in the learning model that we were a big part of, leadership has a system or is a system that's very layered. So how do we ensure school and district leaders are equipped, or are they even willing to undergo the same transformation we demand of our students and educators? What does it really take to lead a transformation? Is it enough for a good administrator, or do we need something else, something more transformational? Because if we're serious about creating equitable, learner-centered schools, we need leaders who are just as courageous and forward-thinking as the graduates we aspire to support. Let's start the conversation. Welcome, Laura. And you know, you've got some guests with you today, too. We're really looking forward to having this conversation.
Yes. Hi, Rebecca. And
Hello.
yes, with me, we have Carmen and Estrada, who are steering committee members for our network. And we are just so thankful and appreciative to be here. It's an honor. Getting Smart podcast is such a dynamic, energetic resource for educators. So we're just thrilled to be here. So thank you.
I'm so glad. And yes, you mentioned Carmen, Chief of Transformational Learning and Leading at Ohio Valley Education Cooperative, and Estrada, Teaching and Learning Coordinator of Secondary Schools, I believe, at Mesa Public Schools. You can correct me if I'm wrong. Laura, can you share a little bit about the Lead for Learners Network, what it is, when did it start?
Yes, I would love to. So Lead for Learners is a national network facilitated by KnowledgeWorks. And we have been desiring to create a national network for a long time. And as you know, with any strategy, it does take a while to get momentum, but ours is growing across the country. And it is really meant to be a resource dedicated to all educators who are working in systems transformation through personalized competency-based learning, but it also covers a plethora of other transformation topics. We created it, as I said, several years ago as a way to connect educators across the country, provide a venue for them to learn with one another, share challenges, share strategies in an easy way. And the best part about it is that the content is driven by its members. They discuss topics that are important to them, relevant to them in the moment. They can do that via our online community forum and or through our monthly events. We host lots of different kinds of events that I'm sure is similar to things that Getting Smart does as well. But we have one, for example, is called Ask Me Anything. And a member will get on there and talk about their learning community and how they're addressing transformation. The other really wonderful thing is that it is free to join and open to everyone.
That's wonderful. As you're listening, we always put links to any resources that are mentioned in the show notes. So if you're interested in what you just heard, we'll have a link for you all to go to. So thanks for sharing the start of that. I think I had known that it was underway. I think you've had some conference sessions too, as you were gathering even more input from other leaders who might have come into that session. So I know you really were making intentional efforts to collect lots of insights. What inspired the development then of this portrait of a leader, and how does it aim to address challenges, as you say, in personalized competency-based learning?
Yeah, so several of us on the steering committee have experienced firsthand the power of a portrait of a learner or a portrait of a graduate. You know,
Mm-hmm.
personally, I came upon that by accident. We just thought, doesn't it make sense to let's think about what do we want our diploma to mean? And how what does it mean? Can we articulate that? Well, of course we could not consistently. We could tell you what we hoped that it meant, but literally the answers weren't good. And there was such power when we said, you know what? Here's what we want at the end of the journey for our learners. Here's how we want them to be equipped. And that is such a powerful lever for change.
Yes.
And so I think because so many of us had experienced that, that just seemed the natural next step. Let's get really clear about what it is we're after for these leaders. These are different leaders. When you can lead this kind of change and we wrestled with it, competency based is a term that is used all the time in lots of different ways. Personalized is another one. So we wanted to get really clear about what that was, what we meant when we said it, and then what are the skills that leaders who can do this have. And so that that brought us to the portrait we have now, many iterations. But we think that clarity in the actual portrait itself gives everyone a common North Star, just like a portrait of a learner. So our hope is that can serve as the North Star. Here's what we're after. Here's what it takes to get there. And let's share this widely and develop a common understanding about what it is we want for our students and what kinds of leaders it will take to get us there.
That's wonderful. I'm going to circle back about that quick, but what you were sharing after this next question, I just want to give you some time to think about it. I also want to think about how some of these that you're mentioning are transferable for student leaders and teacher leaders too, and then how they also show up in different and rich contexts as well as leading change for a large system. Can you also describe that collaborative process then? I mean, we talked about the fact that you brought people together. It was longer than a year. You've been, gathering input. You've had opportunities at symposiums and gatherings. What was that collaborative process behind creating that portrait, and how are educators and leaders from the field contributing to its development, and maybe how will they continue to do?
Yeah, so the members of the steering committee come from across the country, from varied contexts, varied locations. And that group is such a powerful and wonderful group to be a part of. And the perspectives that group represents are really diverse. And so initially, we started with that group, the people on the steering committee, and then we did all kinds of things. We did surveys. We then took iterations of the portrait back to our places of work and to the different people that we serve, and we shared those very broadly. For example, in Kentucky, I shared that with the student voice team, shared it with, honestly, I shared it with anybody who would listen, from my own colleagues to people in districts. We wanted a really broad representative range of feedback on that.
Wonderful. And I can see how you already made that connection to how you had students show up in that space as well. Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. And just to add to that, we, many of us conducted forums, I guess, if you will, right? Both virtually and in person, to gather various leaders and stakeholders from our context. And then just to give a shout out to the KnowledgeWorks team with Kyle, because after we gathered all this information in scripted conversations or recorded Zoom meetings, then the KnowledgeWorks team disaggregated that, right? And then in our next in-person convening following these different forums and conversations we were having with the portrait, they disaggregated all the data points and then brought a new iteration to us as the steering committee met again to then go through that continuous refinement of the cycles. Definitely a team effort, definitely lots of perspectives. And I would say a culminating part of that was great to present an artifact, if you will, of the Portrait of a Leader during the Aurora Institute this past November, and have a pre-session, I guess, at that conference to share the portrait, and then to get feedback from practitioners leading the work in PCBL from cross-varied contexts.
I was able to pop into that session at Aurora. It was wonderful to see so many well-respected leaders in this field in one room talking about leadership and being vulnerable and sharing about how to grow that capacity. It was. I hope that you guys are going to try that again. Maybe we'll have another opportunity for listeners to see that. So in your role as steering committee members, how have you seen this being impactful in your local context, or how do you maybe forecast or predict how it will be useful in your context where you serve?
Yeah, I'm in Mesa, Arizona, and KnowledgeWorks is leading a national cohort for emerging leaders, but we're also going to have an Arizona-specific emerging leader cohort. And that cohort, they're learning, Laura's going to be the main educator, facilitator of that learning that these emerging leaders are going to go through, is going to be driven by the skills, competencies, and attributes of the portrait of the leader. And so just in the Arizona context, having our own cohort, I'm excited for leaders from across the state to come together. We have what's called the Arizona Personalized Learning Network that KnowledgeWorks has assisted with forming. And it's 4 districts throughout the state, 2 of which I've worked in, right? Currently in one, Mesa, and I was in Santa Cruz Valley Unified School District as well as the principal there. And we're going to be able to bring leaders from each of these districts together, emerging leaders, and engage in the portrait of a leader and what it means to lead PCBL work. And I know the roster of leaders coming range from teachers to instructional coaches to current assistant principals. So just really building the bench within the AZPLN. I'm excited for the opportunity.
Yeah, and I can add to that. So one of the things that we're doing here in Kentucky is trying to share the portrait and the work that is happening with our university prep programs that are preparing, from teacher leaders to superintendents, principals. And I have an email ready to go out to those in Kentucky today. And also sharing with all of our co-ops. And so I think the more people can start to use and reference this portrait of a leader, the more likely we are to be able to start to see it really come alive and become the resource that we think it can be. School boards are another really important audience. Anyone who is hiring leaders, we hope that this helps to inform what they should be looking for. I think that's really important. And then Estrada made reference to this. Lots of local districts have grow your own programs. And we just want to get this information out there and say, here's the North Star to develop the kinds of ecosystems we need. Saturation is the strategy.
I heard you say pre-service for leaders, and I heard you guys talk about regional context. I even heard about, in the days of Alaska, Laura can relate to this, but job fairs, when you're going to those situations for how you're looking for site leaders, but also just how districts can promote or advertise what kind of leaders they're looking for to come to their district and how that can be associated with that work, which speaks to that capacity leadership pipeline, right? Maybe could you speak more about how you think this will then also drive sustainable change? Because, naming the thing and being transparent about leadership and what we're looking for, how do you plan or think about how this will impact sustainable change for your educational system, but also others?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And then I put it to some of my leaders this way. I said, what does our bench look like when X, Y, and Z retires, or when this person moves to a different role, or if this person leaves a school? What does our bench look like, and how are we equipping those emerging leaders, regardless of title? How are we equipping them to be prepared to step into those roles to lead PCBL work, right? Not just to step in and lead a school. And I share this constantly with my team here in Mesa, is there's a difference between leading a school effectively and leading PCBL, student-centered, equity-driven work. And so building the capacity in our leaders is, in my opinion, one of the most important things outside of creating successful solutionaries. I think you put, Rebecca, right, in our learners. And I love that word. To build sustainable change, right? We've named it. We have the portrait of a leader. We have, like Carmen mentioned, we have the North Star. And now it's taking leaders, regardless of title, and starting to help instruct, equip, train them, expose them to teachers in the classroom and how they can be a leader of PCBL work within their sphere of influence, right? How instructional coaches within their sphere of influence, and so on and so forth with everyone that leads in a school system. And in the portrait of a leader, as you dive into it, you'll see a section like attributes and action. And it really calls out, like, if you're a teacher leader or an instructional coach, how this applies to you in your role. And I think it's important for sustainable change with these works is oftentimes, and more often than not, a principal of a school is leading the change. And if that principal leaves, we've all probably seen how a school dynamic has changed. But if we can create sustainability within teacher leaders and student leaders and instructional coach leaders, if there's this leadership leading the work at all levels of the school system, if that principal leaves, the work sustains. And the portrait of a leader helps provide that guide and step-ins to how people in various roles can have an impact in their sphere of influence for that sustainable change.
Love that example. Laura, you might have more to add to this, but whenever I think about these pieces, I think, how would I use this? And I know that I've been fortunate enough to be a part of a district that really support leadership to the point where students come first and adult comfort comes second. So to the point of, if there was a site leadership team, they would recognize that the leader that is the head of the school has these strengths, but could benefit from an assistant principal or other folks on their team who have other strengths to kind of bring more of a well-rounded approach to the school. And to the point where if a principal left and an AP moved in, then they would look for that next AP to offset. So I can see this being used to even look at site leadership teams or district leadership teams. Is that something you guys have all talked about as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we were grappling with why are we putting our energy in this, coming from the steering committee, why is this going to be one of our key things that we really want to get out in the world? They all talked about that sustainability piece. And I think it comes up again and again. You can have these dynamic leaders and you can have great leadership teams, but how often do we really invest in our development in a way, in alignment to help that shared vision that we spend, tons of community hours creating because we want what's best for our young people? And because we do want that, we also need to turn into ourselves and each other, right? And I think that's why sustainability is a challenge, right? Because it's not ever going to go away. But I think if you can use something like the portrait of a leader to say, okay, how do we develop leadership here? What do we mean by sustainability in our community? And really talk about it up front and out loud. I think that's one of the things we assume. And it ends up being like, oh, it's the management conversation, right? Or it's the problem of the day, or it's that building goal. But again, I think this is a tool that can help that team and those leaders at all levels really come together in a collaborative way to help their sustainability issues.
I remember when KnowledgeWorks brought a training to a system that I was leading, and it was called Accidental Diminishers. And some of that was really helpful for leaders to see that even with great intentions of what they were bringing back to their sites, they were often, overloading teachers by all the new ideas and concepts they wanted to bring back, kind of throw it out there and see what sticks kind of idea. And I could see how this would be a really useful tool to kind of reflect. You could see how you could crosswalk. Here's the aspirational goals that we have. Here are some things that we can notice about ourselves. I can also see that this transparency provides a safe, place for people to be a little vulnerable and say, hey, this is an area I want more support on. Or as a superintendent, principals coming to me for some training or needs, being able to say, this is an area I'm seeing across my system that we could support better. Like, I think that level of transparency can really support systemic professional learning around that area. And I imagine that you guys probably have something that you could share along that line as far as upcoming events and opportunities. But I could see how that transparency would really feed that work.
Just real quick, I agree with that, because if you're a leader and you're reflecting on your practice, right, and you're able to identify your blind spots or your biases or where you need to improve, the portrait does a great job of giving you something to reflect on and reviewing those competencies, and knowing that this work was and this final product of where it's at was vetted and discussed from leaders across the nation, right, that have been in these roles and lived in these PCBL roles from, depending on whichever year they started, regardless of the politics, right? Like, you can trust that the stuff here is going to push you as a leader if you're looking for that, right? If you're looking for that reflective practice to improve and lead your school and your system to PCBL efforts.
Oh, wonderful. It makes me want to say these traits out loud too. I think listeners will find it, but like, there's a focus on being human-centered, authentic, collaborative, being an advocate, and being transformational. So you can see how all these pieces are showing up in the conversation today with all of you. I want to throw it back to all of you if there's anything else to add, because Estrada, you brought up so many great things too. And I know, Carmen, you've had vast experiences with this and why it would be super helpful. Is there anything else you would want to add for our listeners to know about the portrait of a leader?
Sure. And Estrada and Carmen, feel free to add to this. We're going to be doing a learning lab of sorts, so a deeper dive learning workshop. That's going to happen on May 8th. That'll be open to anyone who wants to join. And again, that information will be on our leadforlearners.org website. So that's our network website. And then, as Estrada mentioned earlier, we're hosting a couple of emerging leader cohorts. These are a year in length. One is going to be Arizona specific, as Estrada mentioned, but we're also going to have a national one, and we are currently recruiting for that. It's due to kick off in June. You will receive personalized coaching, monthly virtual sessions, and in-person convening. All of that professional learning, of course, will be circling around the portrait. As far as the content, that's going to be the driving document, right? But of course, we know when a cohort is formed, right, that collaboration and that community that is built is profound and lasts, right? So I anticipate these cohorts to become long-lasting communities for the members. So if you're interested in that, you can check out all the information, again, at leadforlearners.org. And then, of course, the resource itself is there to download. So those are a few things coming up that we're very excited about.
Very exciting. Thank you for joining us today. Our listeners will see all the links and all the great resources that were mentioned below, and we look forward to tracking this work in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning in to the Getting Smart podcast today. We want this podcast to be actionable, insightful, and a great way to learn about what's next in learning. In order to stay on the cutting edge, we need people in the field to tell us what they're hearing, what they're wanting, and what they're needing to learn more about. Got a topic or a guest in mind? Send your recommendations to me, Mason at gettingsmart.com. And if you like what you're hearing, don't forget to leave a review in Apple Podcasts or subscribe wherever you listen. Feel free to share the podcast on social media using the hashtag GSPodcasts. Thanks so much.